This short video will cover Chapter 6, Adapting to Others. Associated information can be found in your e-text, Communication Principles for a Lifetime. In particular, we'll talk about communication and diversity today. The idea of diversity is important when studying communication behavior because there are many differences among us that can affect the way we communicate and interact. Diversity simply refers to the factors that differentiate us from one another, and in short, it really is culture. Communication researchers focus on studying diversity and how it impacts communication behaviors by zoning in on a few key cultural differences. On a practical level, we encounter individuals of different cultural backgrounds on a daily basis, and sometimes more than we think. Understanding the impact of diversity along with how to communicate with others of different backgrounds is beneficial. Moreover, it's becoming a requirement as our interactions continue to expand to others around the world through ever-developing technology. Culture is at the core of diversity and is defined simply as a learned system of knowledge, behaviors, attitudes, beliefs, values, and norms shared by a group of people and shaped from one generation to the next. Most importantly, I want you to pay close attention to the phrase group of people. Avoid thinking of cultures as simply ethnicity or race or even nationality. The definition is broader than this. Culture can be just about any group that shares knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, etc. Also, each of us has multiple cultures that influence us. For instance, you can be influenced by gender, religion, region, sexual orientation, ethnicity, all at the same time. There's many different layers to our cultural background. Furthermore, co-culture is a smaller culture that exists within a larger culture, which makes things even more complex. For instance, you could have a small co-culture such as Asian American culture that is encompassed within the larger mainstream American culture. That co-culture is influenced by the mainstream American culture while also having influences from Asian heritage. Next, I want to cover a few different approaches to culture that communication scholars typically study. Gender and sex are terms that are often used interchangeably, but it's important to know that they are very different. Sex is simply biological. Think about male versus female. On the other hand, gender is much more complex. It is not categorized in sort of a one-size-fits-all manner, such as sex. So there are many degrees to gender, and oftentimes scholars consider gender to be on a continuum, one from high masculine to low masculine, for instance, or high feminine to low feminine. The idea of androgyny, then, is when individuals will exhibit both masculine and feminine characteristics. Culturally, masculine culture differs from feminine culture in terms of communication. So the masculine approach, which is sometimes called the instrumental orientation, and the feminine approach, which is sometimes called the expressive orientation, are much different. The masculine approach is more assertive, it's straightforward, and it's task-based. There is more focus on the content of the message and less on the nonverbal indicators. On the vice versa, there's the feminine or expressive approach that is more other-oriented. Individuals high in femininity communicate more along the lines of sensitivity and understanding. They aim for quality communication to better develop relationships as well. The next cultural concept that we'll discuss is ethnicity. Just like sex and gender, the terms ethnicity and race are often used interchangeably. However, they are very different. Ethnicity focuses on hereditary, and it's a social classification, so it's derived by a particular society. It's oftentimes based on indicators such as nationality, religion, and language. Individuals who share a common history or background can fall into this group of ethnicity. On the other hand, race is simply assigned to a group of people based on physical characteristics. It's a broader categorization, and there's oftentimes a lot of cultural diversity that it can occur within a given race. Next, I want to get into context. So cultural groups differ in communication on a variety of levels, including context. Context in particular is important to study because it focuses on the setting or environment. individuals from a similar culture understand meaning not only through words, but also through their environment or setting. Some cultures focus more on their context than others. High context cultures focus on the nonverbal indicators in their environment. They are highly attuned to the context. So if you think about high context cultures, you could think about, for instance, in Eastern Asian societies, the meaning of a bow is very important. And so it has more of a meaning in that nonverbal indicator than any words could describe. Low context cultures, on the other hand, focus on verbal meaning, so they are less attuned to the context. And this is when cultures that value talking with one another are more likely low context cultures because they focus on the talk. There's a great table on page 148 in your book. It's table 6.2, where you can find a detailed list for both low and high context cultures, as well as a few examples of countries with higher or lower levels of either context, how much they focus on context. Again, avoid only thinking of culture as countries, but this will definitely help you with your understanding. Culture groups also differ with regard to value, or what they find as important. So Hofstede is a scholar that identified 5 value orientations that are often used to differentiate cultures. Each of these are on a continuum from high to low. So a given culture sits on a particular level in between the two poles. It's not that it's either one extreme or the other. So cultures with higher levels of individualism typically value self-accomplishment rather than group achievement, which is valued by collectivistic cultures, or those that are lower in individualism. Power distance deals with the amount of space that's between those who are in power with those who are not in power. Cultures with higher power differences between people appreciate fewer people having authority and power than those with lower scores on this cultural dimension. Cultures with lower power difference value equality, on the other hand. The next dimension is uncertainty avoidance, which deals with the extent to which a culture is comfortable with uncertainty. Cultures with higher uncertainty avoidance levels do not like uncertainty, so they try to avoid it. They want to know what will happen next, and they like to be informed. On the other hand, cultures that are lower in uncertainty avoidance are comfortable with uncertainty, so they may not ask a lot of questions and not seek out information. The next dimension falls in line with what I discussed earlier. Masculinity is also considered a value orientation under Hofstede's dimensions. Cultures that are more masculine value high achievement and are clearly differentiated sex roles than people with lower scores on that dimension. And again, these are defined sex roles, so the typical man's roles versus the typical woman's are going to be in higher level of masculine cultures. Orientation to time is the last dimension, and with this dimension it regards how individuals consider the future. So cultures that are longer, have longer time orientation value perseverance and thrift. They try to prepare for the future and aim to do better for the future. On the other hand, cultures with short-term orientation to time oftentimes value the past and present. They focus on traditions, which again reiterates their value for the past. They also typically spend rather than save, and that's again because they're not really focused on preparing for the future. So on page 149, there's a great table. Again, it's part 2 of table 6.2. This is just a modified and shortened version of that table. The table provides the cultural value as well as examples for countries that exhibit high or low levels of each of the cultural values. Again, avoid thinking of cultures as countries, but this is definitely really helpful to see the differences in cultures and countries among the cultural values. So now that we've covered a few important elements of culture, let's discuss a bit about barriers that prevent us from adapting to others. And of course, everything that we've talked about in the past in what we've talked about up to this point, deals with how do we improve communication between cultures. At this point, there's some barriers, though, that we can also discuss that oftentimes prevent us from being able to effectively communicate with people from different cultures because it inhibits adaptation. The first one is assuming superiority. And this just is when a culture thinks that they're better than other cultures. There's a term, ethnocentrism, that falls under this barrier. And ethnocentrism occurs when a culture feels that it's superior and that other cultures should assimilate to their cultural desires. So think about sort of a culture that thinks they're the center of the world. So all other cultures should adhere to their cultural values, and if they don't, they're inferior. The next one is assuming similarity, and this is just the idea that a culture assumes that all cultures are alike, so they don't try to adapt to new cultural behaviors or ideas or values because they think that everyone is the same. On the flip side, cultures can also assume differences, which are just the opposite of similarity, where all cultures are different from one another. And this is also a false idea because even though cultures might differ on certain aspects, there could be similarities on some things as well. So just automatically assuming that there's differences can also make it more difficult to adapt to cultures that might be more similar. So the last one is with stereotyping and prejudice. Stereotyping is generalization, so it's only grouping behaviors from a group of people so that it's easier to understand or categorize. Of course, stereotyping doesn't always mean that it's negative. It could be a positive behavior or aspect or attitude that you stereotype, but it still is a generalization, so it's important to know that this is not necessarily true of everybody that falls within that culture. On the other hand, prejudice is making a negative judgment on a culture that's often based on no knowledge or experience. It's just maybe random information that a person has taken in and then makes a negative judgment on a different culture without even meeting anyone from that culture. So obviously, prejudice can be much more hurtful or counterproductive, definitely, for engaging in intercultural communication. So it's something that you will want to avoid. Stereotyping is also something to avoid, but it usually doesn't have the negative outcomes that prejudice can have. So this brings us to the end of this short video on Chapter 6. If you have any questions for us, please contact us at communication, at the communication team inbox, comm@wgu.edu, or you can also give us a call at 1-877-435-7948, extension 1756.